Please welcome CNBC reporter Meg Tirrell, who will be interviewing President and CEO of Illumina, Francis deSouza.
Genomics, genes, DNA, information, genome, genetics. I study DNA. Yeah, I'm cracking the code. I study genomes, genes, and the DNA of DNA of DNA of DNA of DNA.
That song is amazing. We have to first start by telling the story behind that song. Where did that come from?
Isn't it great, Meg? So that group, they're called Music Notes, and it's two teachers, math teachers. They teach high school in South Central LA. And one of the things they do is they write rap songs around science topics to engage the students. And we work with them at the Illumina Foundation, so we actually have a picture of them where they came to Illumina for Bring Your Kids to Work Day, and they share their music. And my older daughter, who's a teenager, actually listened and said, well, they're kind of nerdy cool. And I guess that's high praise in that lingo, so they're fantastic.
I think everybody in this room just aspires to be nerdy cool.
Cool.
We don't actually aspire to be real cool, just nerdy cool. So that's pretty awesome. So Illumina, of course, is the world's biggest maker of genome sequencing machines. We've been talking, just this last session was awesome and really putting into perspective the kind of work that's going on around the world. And you've talked about us being in an inflection point right now for genomics. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's hugely exciting. You know, you heard in the last session that, it's been 15 years now since we published the first human genome. And in the last 15 years, we've seen this huge amount of discovery happen in research around how genomics translates into human health and human diseases. And over the last 15 years, we've been able to drive the cost of doing a single genome from, $3 billion in 2003 in 15 years to now it's $1,000. And I talked about the fact that we at Illumina are working to bring it down to $100 a genome. And what that's meant is all that research is now starting to translate into the clinic. And so, whether it's, understanding predisposition for diseases, diagnosing people with diseases, treating them, choosing gene therapies, we are at the cusp of genomics really entering the mainstream of the clinic, and that's hugely exciting. That's being led primarily by the work going on in oncology and reproductive health, but there's also this huge demand from consumers that you heard Robin talk about a little bit, where people are engaging with their genomes in a way, frankly, that we've never seen before.
So where are most people coming into contact with genomics now, personal genomics? Is it when they have a serious illness and they have to go through a diagnostic odyssey to figure out a rare disease, or when they have cancer, or is it more and more through the consumer threshold?
Yeah, you've touched on, there are a few ways where genomics starts to intersect with people's lives. One way that's really played out over the last few years is through the course of a pregnancy. So in the US, for example, non-invasive prenatal testing using a genomic test has really replaced amniocentesis in a large way for a lot of pregnancies in terms of diagnosing the health of the baby. And what that does is it replaces the use of amniocentesis in high-risk pregnancies, and amnio has a 5.5-inch needle. It provides some risk to the fetus. In a lot of cases, they've actually replaced that with a blood test using NIPT to tell the health of the fetus. And so for a lot of people, that's the first time they intersect with the use of genomic testing. Other places would be in cancer, for example, where we're starting to see cancer. We know cancer is a disease of the genome, and so there are a number of places where cancer intersects with genomics. One is understanding predispositions, and so a lot of people here know that if you have certain mutations in the BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene, you have a much higher predisposition to get breast or ovarian cancer. So in understanding predisposition, but also in choosing therapies. We're starting to see the advent of these targeted therapies and immunotherapies, which are incredibly successful, but for a very specific group of people. And so we're starting to see the use of genomic testing to match patients who have cancer with therapies. Other areas we're seeing genomics show up is in diagnosing people who have rare and undiagnosed diseases. Rare diseases sound rare, but there are 30 million Americans that have these rare genetic diseases. And today, when a child is born that has a genetic disease, on average, the child will go through an 8+ year diagnostic odyssey, deal with 10+ specialists before they're diagnosed. And very often they're misdiagnosed an average of 3 times. We're starting to see now that if that child is sequenced, either whole genome or whole exome, within the first few days of birth, you can get a diagnostic yield of 30+% of the cases where you can definitively say what the child has, and that's huge. And then there's a whole consumer space where people are starting to understand that there are things they want for their lifestyle that they can get from genomic testing.
Well, in the medical arena, so much of this, of course, comes down to what gets paid for. Where do we stand right now in terms of insurance reimbursement for these kinds of things? And maybe specifically start with the prenatal testing.
Yeah, so there have been a few success stories in getting reimbursement. One is in prenatal testing. So NIPT has become, I think, one of the fastest diagnostic tests adopted in US history. And what's happened is, the payers in the US will pay for NIPT for high-risk pregnancies. So if a woman is over 35 or there's a family history of complications in pregnancy. We're also seeing a big move in payers reimbursing for whole exome testing in the US for kids that have genetic diseases. So if you think about 2017, that inflection point, we came into the year with less than 10 million covered lives having access to whole exome sequencing for a child or parents that have a genetic disease. And over the course of the year, payers started covering it, and we exited the year with over 100 million lives now covered for whole exome testing for genetic diseases. We're also seeing movement in reimbursement for genetic tests to select therapies for oncology. We've seen great progress from CMS around reimbursing the use of panels to select therapies. So we're starting to see payers move forward in terms of reimbursement.
So often in the oncology space, it seems to be coming from the standpoint of, okay, well, here's a drug that targets the specific mutation, or in the case of some of the immunotherapies, a set of mutations, and then they say, okay, we're going to have this companion diagnostic. You'd wonder if you're a cancer patient, you'd want to know what's going on, regardless of whether there's a drug that happens to have a companion diagnostic for it. And where are we in that thing?
You're absolutely right. I think the first step is a step we're taking, which is really coming up with companion diagnostics for the different drugs to really understand what are the markers that will drive the efficacy of immunotherapies or those targeted therapies. But the model needs to change going forward. Instead of saying, look, I'd like to try this therapy, let me run the companion diagnostic and see if the patient is a fit, what we need to get to is to say, let's run a diagnostic and see what therapies are a fit for this patient. Because if you look at it now, there are over 1,000 oncology drugs in clinical trials. This whole idea of, I want to try this, let's do this test, I want to try this, that model doesn't scale. And so I think we do get to a world where you start with a diagnostic that's pan therapy, and then choose the right therapies, and maybe even choose combinations of therapies, because we saw that be very successful in the treatment of HIV.
Do you envision a world at some point when the cost of getting your whole genome sequenced is so low, and I'd be curious to know how low you think that cost can get, that everybody will get their genome sequenced as a routine part of care? And is cost the barrier to that, or is clinical utility the barrier to that?
I do believe that we do get to a point where the starting point of your health record is your genome. And that tells you your predisposition to different conditions. It informs your pharmacogenomic profile, so it tells you if you have a condition, what drugs work for you. There's a guy I work with who actually discovered that because of his genetic makeup, there's a type of anesthesia that's commonly used that would put him into sudden cardiac arrest if it was used on him. And so what he does now is when he goes to surgery, he just lets them know, and they use a different kind of anesthesia.
Is that Jay Flatley?
That was Jay, actually.
A guy who works, former CEO of Illumina.
He's the former CEO of Illumina, and he's told this story very publicly. I know, for example, there are certain statins that don't work for me at all, and other ones that would. So, whether it's understanding predisposition, understanding your pharmacogenomic profile, or being on the watch for conditions, that may show up for you, I think it will be the starting point of most people's health records. I think we get there. In some cases, we may get there at birth, right? And I think there's a time in the future where today there are a set of tests that are done for children at birth. I think it's possible that you may do the whole genome for kids at birth. And then there was a really interesting study that was just published in the recent edition of the New England Journal of Medicine, where they actually were able to cure or mitigate a genetic defect in a fetus before the baby was born. And in this case, the baby had an inherited disorder that would have caused the baby to be born with no sweat glands. It turns out that for the right development to happen, the fetus needed a certain protein between weeks 10 and 20. And so what the doctors did was they injected the protein into the amniotic sac during those weeks, and the baby was born with sweat glands. And so, we used to be, in our most ambitious thinking, we used to say, well, shoot, everybody's going to be sequenced, and maybe at birth. And now we're thinking, well, maybe everybody will be sequenced, and maybe even before birth.
And what is the ticket to getting there? What needs to happen to create a world where everybody's getting sequenced in the womb?
I think it's the things you touched on, which is, demonstrate the clinical utility and the economic value. And that's a little bit of a chicken and egg, because to demonstrate the utility, you have to do it, and you don't do it until you have the utility. And so one of the things that we're doing at Illumina is we announced a little while ago a partnership with Harvard Pilgrim out in the Northeast. And that's around non-invasive prenatal testing. So today, while the vast majority of women who have a high-risk pregnancy have access to NIPT and it's reimbursed, only 40% of covered lives have access to NIPT if they're deemed average risk, so under 35 with no family history. But we do believe there's value in doing it for average risk pregnancies. And so what we've announced with Harvard Pilgrim, it's the first time it's been done for genomic testing, is a risk-sharing program, where for just over a year, we will enter a risk-sharing program with them where they offer all pregnancies NIPT. And we have partnered with the University of Colorado to collect the data that you get from doing that and really demonstrate whether health costs go up or down, and we track the outcomes too. And so it'll take things like that, where you get in front of it to gather the data to show clinical utility and economic value. It's the work that GEL is doing with the 100,000 Genomes project, and so it'll take those kinds of things.
What happens if the data show that it doesn't save money?
If the outcomes aren't better or it doesn't save money, then it's not the right fit for that scenario. But I'll give you an example. In rare and undiagnosed genetic diseases, we started the conversation with payers, and I said, so you have somewhere around 5% of babies born have some kind of genetic disease. And the stats are that on average, those babies go 8 to 10 years before they're diagnosed, 10 plus specialists, lots of tests. Many of the families go bankrupt in the process. And that a night in the NICU, can cost sometimes up to the 6 figures. And so that was one of the cases where we didn't need a whole lot of analysis with the payers to say, look, the math is really compelling. If in the first few days of a child's birth and the baby's not thriving, you do a whole genome sequence of the trio or a whole exome sequence, and you can get 30 to 50% of the time of diagnosis. That saves a lot of money in the system. So in some cases, you don't need the big analysis. The benefits are so clear.
How low do you see the cost of sequencing getting at its lowest?
It's a great question. So, the cost went in 2003 from $3 billion. It's now $1,000. And a year ago, I announced at JP Morgan, and I think we talked then, that we at Illumina are committed to continuing to drive the price down. We believe we have line of sight in the coming years to take that price down to $100. And so, we think there's room. And we think that as we do that, and this has been true throughout the history of the company, and we just celebrated our 20th anniversary this month, our whole company is based on the idea that as we drive the cost of sequencing down and we make genomics more accessible to everybody, the market for everyone just grows. And that's been a thesis that's been true so far, and we believe it'll be true for the next decade.
We've been talking a lot about the All of Us project that's kicking off this weekend, trying to sequence 1 million Americans. Is Illumina the biggest beneficiary of projects like that? Do you guys do most of the work for these kinds of things?
I believe the patients in the community will be the biggest beneficiary.
Business beneficiary.
But in terms of, clearly they're out getting bids for both the sequencing side and the arrays, and we are bidding for them. There will be other players that bid for them too. But we feel like we invest like 16, 17% of our revenue in R&D, which is twice the industry average. And so, we spend a lot in terms of making sure, we believe we have the best technology in the market, and we're committed to doing that.
Do we have the sequencing capacity really to handle the amount that is coming on board in the coming years? There was, I think, a Wired article about the project that's kicking off that said we don't in the United States to be able to sequence that many people right now.
It's funny because sometimes I get from investors wait, your sequencer's getting more and more powerful. Is there too much capacity? But I think your question is actually the better one, because if you start to, because the truth is there's not overcapacity in the market, as you can see from how we're doing. But if you start to think about a world where everybody is sequenced as just the base of their genomic record, of their health record, and if somebody's unfortunate enough to get cancer, then they're sequenced multiple times to choose the therapy, to monitor the progression of the therapy, to see if it recurs. If somebody decides to have a child, they get sequenced multiple times for carrier status, for the health of the baby, the fetus. we're going to need an awful lot of sequencing. And most of the things I talked about were at the very, very beginning. Less than 5% of all cancers are sequenced today. Way less than that of children who have genetic diseases are sequenced today. And almost every market for genomics, we're at the very, very beginning.
How does the US compare with other countries in terms of the amount of sequencing we're doing and the rate of people who could potentially benefit from sequencing actually getting it?
The US was off to a really strong start in 2003. Although, sequencing the human genome was an international effort, there was a very strong US presence in that effort. But now, if I look at what's happening in England with Genomics England, that is a pioneering effort from not just the research community and the £100 million that Prime Minister Cameron sort of committed to that project, but they're moving phase 2 into the health system as part of the NHS, where sequencing will be part of the standard of care for oncology and for genetic diseases. I think they're further ahead than we are, and I think the work now that Francis Collins is kicking off with all of us is going to put us in the right direction, but they are off to a 3-4 year head start. And then China is emerging as a real powerhouse of sequencing, both in terms of the research dollars they committed. So we committed under President Obama $1.5 billion to the Precision Medicine Initiative, and a part of that will be around genomics. And then China came out and said they were going to commit $10 billion to their Precision Medicine Initiative. And they've started to follow through. We've seen a lot of projects from a research perspective. We've seen rapid adoption from a clinical perspective. So today, China is already our second largest market. So it's the US and then China. China has a much higher growth rate. It is much smaller, but it's already taken every country in Europe in terms of the amount of sequencing it does.
Wow. And if you go to Iceland, of course, it's a much smaller country, but so many people there have had their genome sequenced. Like, you just talked to your barista and they've had their genome sequenced, and then they have all this amazing ancestry data they can match up. That brings up these incredible privacy concerns. There's even a debate there over whether women who have the BRCA mutation, which can be deduced from their relatives' genomes that have been sequenced and then their connection to them, should be told. And this, of course, brings me to the whole privacy question.
Yes.
There's a sort of long-winded way of getting there. How do you look at privacy, especially when we just had the Golden State Killer case, where everybody's wondering about how protected these databases are?
Yeah, look, our position is genomic information is private information. It's also healthcare information. So there are laws that cover managing the privacy of genomic data. Certainly if you look at the big consumer providers, whether it's Helix, but also 23andMe and Ancestry, they all have their privacy statements. And in fact, in the Golden State Killer case, you've had a number of them come out and be very clear that they don't work with law enforcement on open-ended investigations. Obviously, they'll comply with the law if there's a very specific subpoena or court order against a targeted individual for specific data against a specific crime. Now, that's not what this is. So in general, and all of you here should make sure that you're familiar with the privacy policies of the services you use. The Golden State Killer case was a really interesting one. For those of you that don't know, this is a serial killer who raped over 50 women and killed over a dozen between 1976 and 1986. And then the case went cold. And recently, law enforcement here in California actually took some of the old DNA of the killer that was from those crime sites, sequenced it, and then went to an open source website. So it's GED Match, run out of Florida, where people put in their DNA voluntarily, and they build family trees voluntarily on that site. And it's an open source site, and it says that the information you put here, you can make publicly available, which a lot of people did. What the police were able to do then is, from the data they put in of the killer, they were able to identify relatives that had put that information online. And then, based on what they deduced around the suspected age of the killer, the suspected gender of the killer, they were able to narrow it down and then ultimately catch the person who was the serial killer, they believe, and they're pursuing a case against him. But that was done in an open source website where people were told that you're putting your stuff into an open community. So a lot of people are wondering, well, what does this mean for the information I've put? And I think that's completely different from what you see from Ancestry and 23andMe. But genomic data is health data. It is important. Everybody who deals with it needs to respect that and deal with frankly, the regulations around managing genomic data.
Everybody likes to say you can change your credit card number, you can't change your DNA if that somehow gets hacked or stolen. What kinds of protections can you guarantee are in place when people are giving you their genetic data?
So in general, we are in the business of selling the machines that do sequencing, and it's really our customers who generate the data. And if you think about who our customers are, they could be hospitals, like a lot of the cancer hospitals, and they have a long history of dealing with people's personal health records, and this falls under the same privacy regulations, HIPAA compliance that they follow. There are the consumer genomics companies, and they also are stewards of customers' data. In some cases, some of them will ask people if they want to participate in research projects, and in those cases, they will share the data for those research projects. The consumer services are different, so it's important that you understand the privacy stances of each of the consumer services. And then one of the things that we do at Illumina is, and we've done this for years, we've created an ethics board where we meet with every year with leading bioethicists. And genomics is a very, very powerful tool. And so we want to make sure we're starting to think about what are the issues that could emerge from the use of genomic information. And so we have been public where it's been important for us to lend a voice around protecting genomic information. So for example, it is now illegal in the US for insurance companies to discriminate against people for health insurance based on the genomic data. That was an effort that we lent our voice to because we thought that that was important. And so we've identified areas where we think the regulations aren't quite there or the policy isn't quite there, and we will engage where we feel we can add help.
Well, we're out of time. My last question for you is a really quick one. $100 genome, what year do we get there?
We've said it's in the next few years. We haven't said a specific year. So unfortunately, I can't give you a year, but good try.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks, everybody, and thanks,
Thank you.
Susan.
Thank you, Meg.
Thank you, Meg and Francis.